welcome to the Wednesday edition of Katrina's Creations. Today is going to be another family story. You all seem to like when I tell you stories about the history of my family. So today is going to be another interesting one. My parents have moved at this point, but in the process of moving, they took something down off the wall that I haven't seen up close in several years because they had a big cathedral ceiling that was hanging up there. So they let me take it home so I could share it with you. So then it's going back to their house. But for the time being, I'm babysitting it. So what it is a Navajo rug. Now there's an interesting story behind it. So we'll get started with the beginning of it. If you remember my story a few months ago about my grandma's flapper dress, if you missed that video and want to check it out, you can click the link here and that will take you over to it. But that grandmother is involved with this story. She was born in 1909 and my grandfather was born in 1910. They both lived in the Colorado area. Now, my grandparents didn't get married till they were 26 and 27 years old. So they were a little older when they got married, and my mother was born like 3 years later. Now my grandfather at the time worked for the Bureau of Reclamation, which is, they handle like the Bureau of Land Management. They deal with different properties and things like that for the government. And during his career with them, he worked with them up till the Kennedy administration. And at that time, he was as high up as he could go without presidential appointment. So that was when he decided it was time to retire. And I wish I would have picked my grandmother's brain a little bit more before she passed away, because one day we were having dinner and she mentioned that she had had breakfast with Jacqueline Kennedy, and while she was having coffee and donuts, the President Kennedy came in and sat down and had coffee with them, that she was with her ladies group. Well, I kind of pieced together that that would have been about the time Jacqueline Kennedy was refurbishing the White House with some of the, trying to get the original furnishings and bring the house back to what it should have been. And so it kind of makes sense that she would have been meeting, trying to raise funds with my grandmother's women's club that she was in. But she also mentioned that my grandfather and her would go to they went to several functions in the East Room of the White House. And she said they never ate dinner there, but that there would be after dinner entertainment and they would go for that. So he worked for them until the early 1960s, and then he worked for the World Bank after that. So he traveled around the world extensively at that point. And I did another video a while back where I showed you all of my foreign dolls that he brought back from the different countries that he visited, the souvenir dolls. So if you missed that video, you can check that link too. So anyway, where this rug comes in was during the first years of their marriage. They were married in 1936. At that point, my grandfather worked as a surveyor for the Bureau of Reclamation. And they moved every 2 weeks. In fact, he told me one time that he was one of the first people to walk across Hoover Dam. So I'm assuming that's maybe when he was doing the surveying. But they moved every 2 weeks, and his paycheck didn't catch up to them. So I was asking my grandmother about the rug one time, and I said, whatever prompted you to buy a Navajo rug? And she said, well, we were out west, the seats on our car got hot, so we bought this rug. It was on the floor of a Navajo hogan, which is sort of like a wigwam. It's their shelter, it's what they live in, or what they were dwelling in at this time. And she bought it, she says, we bought it off the floor, and it was on a dirt floor, and it smelled because it had been on the floor, and it was dirty because it had been on a dirt floor. So she did wash it, which unfortunately made the color bleed in one spot. But she told me it was to keep the seats from being too hot to sit on. I suspected there was a little bit more to the story, So with a little bit more probing, we kind of discovered that my grandfather paid $10 for it in 1936. That's right in the mid-Depression era when $10 was pretty precious money. When they could have gotten a blanket, if they just wanted a blanket to put over top of the seats of the car, they could have gone to any five and dime and picked up one for probably $1 or $2 during the Depression era. So why did they spend $10 on a Navajo rug? Here's what they were doing. Because, like I said, his paycheck wouldn't catch up to them for 2 weeks because they moved every 2 weeks and stayed in a hotel while he did his work. So they would go into town and they would find the pawn shop and they would pawn this rug, which is basically borrowing the money against that rug using as collateral. And that's what they would live on until his paycheck caught up with them. And then they'd go back to the pawn shop and buy the rug back. So they kind of bought it as an investment to get them by from paycheck to paycheck while they traveled around. So anyway, I always thought it was kind of an interesting story. And for years, this rug sat in the basement of our house. And then my mother had it looked at by some women who were Navajo, and they did know what they were looking at, and they were able to tell her a little bit more about this rug. So I'm going to turn the camera around. I've got it actually laying on my kitchen floor because that's where the lighting is the best. So I'm going to turn the camera around and I'm going to show you a little bit about the rug and some of the interesting fine points of it. So let's get turned around. All right, here is the rug. It measures 52 inches across and 57 inches in length. Now, the colors on it are a grayish brown and red and black and kind of an ecru color. It's not a white. I'm taking it up through the center of it so you can see it. Now the interesting thing about this type of rug is it can be folded, the two sides can be folded to the center and the pattern will match. The other interesting thing with this is they used different fibers for this. We believe that this rug was made sometime in the late 1800s to about 1910, somewhere in that time period. And during this time period, there was the Navajo churro, which was a specific type of sheep that were used to use the wool to make these blankets. However, when they moved the Navajo onto the reservation and the climate was slightly different, the sheep didn't fare too well, and so they were replaced by Rambouillet from England. But this particular blanket or rug is made with several different types of fiber. There is fiber here, this tan color, which is actually rabbit. You can see some of the softer hairs of the rabbit. They do believe it was woven by a young girl because the points are so crisp. You can see how sharp the edges are on all of these points. The other interesting thing is some of the dyes are different. You can see here that the dyes don't exactly match and that it runs across here in a different color. So they were pretty much making this with whatever they could get their hands on. So there are several different types of fiber involved with this. And this is where you can see where my grandmother washed it. It's not showing up really well in the camera, but there's a faint fading right in here where the red kind of washed into the lighter color a little bit. Now, the other interesting thing about this, I'm going to try to get this as close as I can so you can see how tightly woven it is. This is the only real damage that you can see on the entire blanket is right here. These white threads are actually the warp. The warp runs this direction. The weft runs back and forth. Now, Navajo weaving is not done on a regular loom as we think of a loom. It's done on a frame that stands upright, like a tapestry, like your medieval tapestries. And so the warp runs up and down, and the weft you weave back and forth this way. So you can see where the white is, you can see that that is part of the warp. So a white warp was used on this. The other thing that's interesting to see, you can see it especially in these lighter colors, this is like a mattress stitch. This is how they did the edges of this. There were some Mexican rugs that are made that look very, very similar to Navajo. And this is how you can tell the difference, because the Mexican rugs actually fold over and then they stitch behind. So this shows that it is authentic by this. So that is my grandmother's and grandfather's Navajo rug.